Feeble attraction is such a joy, as is usually the case with Cheers, and a little emotional as well. I don't know why, but for some reason I found this episode to be a bit more challenging to watch than the previous one I watched after the passing of George Wendt. I think maybe it just feels a little bit more real now. I've only watched 2 episodes since he passed away, and I don't know why, but this one was a lot more emotional, even though both of the episodes, coincidentally, were quite Norm heavy. So definitely an emotional experience, but very funny with some wonderful quotes that I want to share. So as always, I will go through the episode chronologically and share some thoughts along the way and some, not really goofs, but, well, maybe 2 goofs. I'll talk about those as we get there. And we start off with the guys arguing about the greatest American hero, and Frasier says that in the 90s there are no great heroes left. And, well, this aired at the end of 1989. It aired on the 7th of December, to be exact. So I don't know if this was meant to air a little later, but it wasn't actually in the 90s. But nevertheless, they carry on with this conversation. And just after Frasier says that, Sam comes in with his date, and he presents his date to the bar, and his date actually comprises 4 women. It's a decent enough way to start things off, and they all start chanting and hailing Sam as the hero. It feels a little bit more like season 1 and 2 Sam. And this is not unique to this episode. There have been a couple of times where post Diane, it does feel like Sam's backtracked a little bit, but which is actually very believable. So I just find that to be quite interesting. Woody then comes in and says it's the second coldest day in the history of Boston. And then Rebecca says that Robin has bought her a desk. And then Cliff comes in. And then Sam comes in. We have a lot of things happening in the first couple of scenes until we establish the main narrative. And this happens when Norm reveals that he's having to let his secretary Doris go because he's just not getting the work anymore. He doesn't need a secretary, can't really afford to keep her. So he's writing her a letter of recommendation on a cocktail napkin. And then Rebecca says to Woody, if you pretend you're interested in my desk, I'll pretend I'm interested in your weather, because they're both talking about things that nobody cares about. Rebecca tries to take an interest. It doesn't really work. Doris then comes in. She's played by Cynthia Stevenson, and her performance in this episode is just absolutely fantastic. Frasier said something that made no sense to me. He said that Norm's going to fire the Morton Salt Girl. I had no idea who the Morton Salt Girl was, so I googled that and I learned a bit. So that was great. And Norm talks to her and says, I'm going to have to let you go, but here's a letter of recommendation. And Norm, to his credit, is quite adamant that this is going to happen. He's not kind of skirting around it. And I say this because at some point, many episodes ago, in fact, many seasons ago at this point, he had to let people go. That was his role when he worked for this firm. So it's a very different side of Norm, where we see here he's not really that nervous about doing it. He's much more straight to the point, and I thought that was quite interesting. And then she says, I love you too, Mr. Peterson, which I think nobody could have guessed. She's reading too much into this letter of recommendation, and she eventually leaves. And Frasier says to Norm, that was a very hard thing to do and an even harder thing to watch, which I agree with. It was very, very awkward and quite funny, but also uncomfortable, but in a way that's quite entertaining. Rebecca then gets the desk, and then Norm comes in and says that he keeps seeing Doris everywhere. And then Doris comes in and says to Norm, can I warm up your seat for you? To which Norm replies, it's okay, Doris, it's never cold. And I think for me that was the turning point, with the episode being quite emotional, because, well, it gets a little colder now, doesn't it? So that for me was the turning point, when it became just a little challenging to watch. And Carla, I noticed her earrings at that point. She has on these giant snowflake earrings that basically go from her earlobe to her shoulder, and I absolutely love them. Norm, again, is then really assertive with Doris and tells her that she has to leave and that he's not interested in anybody but Vera, but even then not really that interested in her, which we know is just part of Norm's love language. And I really like this side of Norm. I feel like it's very different to Norm a couple of seasons ago, and it's really interesting to see. And he tries to get her to leave, and she starts singing Seasons in the Sun, which was really random. And then she eventually does leave, and the others are listening to the radio, and there's actually a competition on the radio for what was the coldest day in Boston. And Carla phones up on behalf of Woody and thrusts the phone into Woody's ear, and he answers and says it was the 12th of January, 1981. And then he kept talking, and the radio person ended up telling him to shut up. And I googled it, and apparently the coldest day was actually in 1934. I don't know why they didn't get that right, unless that information wasn't readily available for them at the time. Obviously, in 2025, we have much quicker, easier access to that kind of knowledge. But either way, I don't care that much. And it was still a really, really funny scene. And Woody's going to Hawaii. He won the competition. He's going to Hawaii. We'll come back to Woody in a bit. Rebecca then got a fax from Robin about her desk. And he told her that there's a hidden secret in the desk. And she's not allowed to get that information until he comes back. And I've only just realised something, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, actually. It could be another goof. Maybe not. Maybe I'm overlooking something. I'll come to that in a moment. But he basically tells her, don't go looking for it. I want to be the one to surprise you with this gift when I come back. Obviously, the drawers are all locked. She can't get into it. But there is a keyword to give her a hint, to give her a clue. And that keyword is ring. And I think Rebecca understandably very quickly jumped to the fact that it was going to be a proposal, but I feel like that would be too obvious. I feel like that wouldn't really be a clue. That would be telling her what's in it. So we get a bit of mystery, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. This is also the point when I noticed Carla's jumper, and she's wearing this jumper, this sweater. It's like this gorgeous pinky maroony kind of colour with a black and white cat on it, and it looks so much like Sylvester, as in the Warner Brothers character Sylvester and Tweety. And I googled it just to see if I could find a vintage Sylvester jumper or sweater. I couldn't find this exact one, but if anybody can confirm if it is Sylvester, I feel like it looks a little different. I don't know, I'm maybe overthinking it, but my immediate thought was that looks like Sylvester. And I absolutely love it, and I would absolutely wear it. Norm then leaves, and he tells Sam that he will see him in the morning. And Sam said that he might be a little bit late, to which Norm responds, "It's okay, I had a key made." Which I absolutely love. And as Norm leaves, we see his legs walking up the steps outside, and then immediately after we see this yellow coat as Doris follows him. And I love the costume choice for Doris. She's wearing this yellow rain mac, this yellow raincoat, and it's just so bright and so vivid, and it was such a great choice because it really stands out, particularly in that moment as we see her following him up the steps. I really, really love it. And then Norm screams, and he comes back in this panic, and Doris is following him around, chasing after him. But credit to Norm again, he's actually quite sensitive about the situation. I feel like if I were Norm in that situation, I'd just be getting really, really angry. And he asks Sam to get her some hot chocolate. He then goes to talk to Frasier to get some help and advice. And Frasier suggests building up Doris's confidence so she doesn't feel like Norm is the only person who would care for her at all. And Norm does. He talks to her. He says the right things. He says that there are many guys who'd be interested in her. She shouldn't just settle for Norm. And she says, how do you know people would be interested in me? And she mentions Norm's letter, and he points out that Norm didn't really write the letter of recommendation himself. Everybody else helped out, and he points out that Cliff wrote some of it. He wrote one particular word, and now Cliff and Doris are talking, and actually I never really thought about this until it happened, but they seem like a really good pairing. Cliff absolutely wants something, or somebody rather, who dotes on him, a relationship where he is basically worshipped, and that's exactly what Doris would give him. And she asks him, once he's out of the service, could they go on a date? To which Cliff replies, "There's actually no rule against male men dating women, it just sort of turns out that way." Which I rather liked. And Norm then said to Frasier, they're at the bar, and Norm said, "It seems strange not having that sad, pathetic creature following me around all the time." It was so obvious that it meant Cliff, but even when Norm confirmed he was talking about Cliff, it was an absolute joy and a rather great moment. Woody then comes in dressed for Hawaii, and apparently he had to dress that way outside the radio station for some photographs. And then the delivery driver comes in with something from his truck that must have fallen out the desk. And this is the bit that I think is maybe a bit of a goof, because he gives them this kind of black box But if it was inside the desk in a locked drawer, and we know the drawer is locked, Rebecca's frantically trying to get in it, how would it have fallen out? Sure, maybe it was in a drawer that was meant to be locked and whoever had the desk didn't lock the drawer properly. Maybe that's the case. But it just seemed like a bit of an oversight that it was meant to be something that Rebecca couldn't access, yet it was still able to fall out of the desk. So I think maybe a bit of an oversight. And Carla actually opens up this box and she pulls out this piece of paper and she begins to look at it, and Sam's looking at it as well. And we learn that this desk once belonged to George Bernard Shaw, and it's called the ring desk because there was a ring on it from his teacup. So it's not about having an engagement ring or anything. It is simply because George Bernard Shaw left a ring with his teacup, and Sam reads that it was appraised to, and I quote, 5, look at all those zeros. So my guess is probably 5 million. I doubt it would be 50 million, could be 500,000. Either way, it's appraised for a lot of money. And he decides he needs to go and tell Rebecca, and as soon as he opens the office door, all we hear is this chainsaw. Rebecca is trying to get in this desk, taking extreme measures, clearly damaging the very expensive desk in the process. And I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. I think I would have liked to have seen Rebecca's reaction when she learned about the desk, but also leaving us hanging and not showing her reaction allows us to just assume what would have happened. So I don't mind it too much, but we know Rebecca is often very overly dramatic with how she responds to things. I think it would have been quite fun to see her response. The rest of the episode focuses on Doris, and Doris goes to powder her nose. So Cliff says to the others, boy, am I dreaming or what? Somebody pinch me. Carla practically leaps to his side and pinches him hard. And then Norm said something that I thought was quite interesting. Norm suggested that Cliff was just using Doris. And I never really read that into it. I never really felt like Cliff was just using Doris to go to bed with her. I genuinely thought that maybe he could have been interested in her because it would be the kind of relationship that he wants. Not an equal relationship because she would worship him, but I feel like that wasn't my reading of it, so that was quite an interesting moment. And Cliff tries to say that that's not the case because, and I quote, I'm the one who said she was prompt. And Norm responds, you're a mailman, what do you know about prompt? Cliff challenges Norm to a fight, and then Norm responds with, oh, I'm really shaking, Cliff. What are you going to do, speed sort me? A lot of mailman insults in this episode, and I found it to just be absolutely brilliant. Doris comes back from the bathroom, and she thinks that they've been fighting over her. Frasier speaks with her and tells her to basically look at the situation differently, and she finally sees that actually, yes, I can do better than you, and I can do better than you. And then she reaches Norm and says that she doesn't think she can do better than Norm. And obviously this is basically back to square one with Norm, and Norm finds a solution. He's going to hire her again. And she doesn't have workplace relationships. So yeah, Norm has to pay for this. He has to employ her again, but she's no longer going to follow him around. And when the others question this, he basically just explains, well, he bought Vera a house, I guess, to stop her doing the same kind of thing. And it was a fun way to end things. I thought it worked really well. And I like the fact that also the ball was kind of back in Doris's court at the end. Yes, Norm took control of the situation by hiring her again. That's difficult to say. Hiring her again. But then she was the one who said, I don't date people I work with. And then that was her in control of the situation again. So I quite like that. I thought it was an interesting way to take things, and I thought it worked really well. It's an amazing episode, as they usually are. Yes, it was quite emotional to get through, particularly after that point when Norm said to, when he said to Doris that his seat is never cold. It's just, it's difficult. It gets easier, but it's difficult. But it's a beautiful episode. I don't have any personal highlights with this one because I just think the whole thing was an absolute beauty. The only room for improvement, in my opinion, is I would have liked to have seen Rebecca's reaction when she learned the value of the desk, which presumably would be worth significantly more than any ring Robin would have bought Rebecca. But that being said, it's Robin Colcourt, so maybe not. Either way, Feeble Attraction is a delightful episode. I absolutely adore every second of it. Very funny, Some great quotes. None of the goofs are a big deal, but they're a lot of fun, and I loved it. Feeble Attraction is an absolute delight.